Hey everyone! Tonight, we're opening a file that was never meant to see the light of day. A top-secret operation buried beneath miles of Greenland ice, hidden from allies, hidden from the soldiers who served, and hidden from history itself. This wasn't science, and it wasn't exploration. It was Cold War espionage at its most audacious, a subterranean labyrinth built to house nuclear weapons, deceive nations, and outwit Moscow itself. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe, only if you're ready to follow secrets where most people aren't allowed to look. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether you'd survive a world where your allies are being lied to at the highest levels. Now, steady your nerves. Tonight, we're diving into 1959 Greenland and cracking open the classified frozen heart of Project Iceworm. It began with a cable, not the kind strung on telephone poles or humming under oceans, but a single classified message typed in urgency, transmitted across the Atlantic and buried in the locked drawers of Washington's archives. Its words were stark, clinical, and utterly chilling. A nuclear fortress beneath the Greenland ice sheet, location undisclosed. The cable sat there for decades, sealed by law and by fear, until the 1990s, when someone unsealed the envelope of history. The revelation struck like a ghost returning from the frozen depths. The United States, in the height of the Cold War, had tried to build a city under the ice, an invisible city, dug not for survival, but for war. Fast forward to 2024. NASA's ice-penetrating radar, designed to track the melting Greenland ice sheet, flickers across screens in laboratories. The data scrolls in jagged lines, digital echoes bouncing off layers of ancient ice. Then, ghostly shapes appear, long rectangular voids, tunnels curving like the veins of a buried machine. They are too precise, too engineered to be natural. Buried under decades of snow, still hidden from satellites, still resisting the erosion of time, the tunnels whisper of a secret never meant to surface. It was never meant to be seen, the voice says, low and certain. Not by the Soviets, not by the Danes, not even by most of the men who lived inside it. What NASA has rediscovered is not just an engineering curiosity. It is a grave marker of an audacious intelligence gambit, one that straddled the knife edge between invention and madness. The city under the ice was not only a Cold War experiment, it was a weapon disguised as science, a chess move buried beneath snowflakes, designed to deceive allies, outwit enemies, and hide the deadliest arsenal of all. They called it Project Iceworm. But before Iceworm had a name, before it was whispered in classified memos, it began with shadows, with the kind of paranoia that soaked the world in the late 1950s. America had watched the Soviet Union launch Sputnik into orbit, that little silver ball blinking defiantly across the night sky. It was more than a satellite. It was a signal, a declaration that Moscow had the means to strike from above, to send weapons across continents, to hold the balance of fear in its hands. And in Washington, in Langley, in the hushed corridors of the Pentagon, men in dark suits and gray uniforms began asking, where can we hide the things that must never be seen? Air bases in Europe were vulnerable. Submarines prowled the seas, but the oceans could be tracked. What about the ice? What about Greenland? A vast white desert of silence, thousands of miles of frozen cover, where radar faltered, where eyes could not see, where tunnels could stretch endlessly under snow. In the mind of a military planner, Greenland was not empty. It was an opportunity. The official story was simple. Denmark, sovereign over Greenland, but strategically dependent on American goodwill, was told that the United States wanted to build a research station, a platform for studying glaciology, geology, maybe even climate science. The pitch was flattering. Denmark would play host to a cutting-edge project, a collaboration that would place its Arctic territory at the center of global science. Diplomats in Copenhagen signed papers, nodded politely, and toasted with small glasses of aquavit. They believed, or at least pretended to believe. But even as they signed, a second set of memos moved quietly through the Pentagon's Army Corps of Engineers and into the back channels of the CIA. These memos bore the codename Iceworm. They described not a laboratory, but a lattice. Thousands of miles of tunnels, capable of hosting over 600 nuclear missiles, hidden like knives in a snowbank. Few outside the innermost circle even knew the name. The men assigned to build the Ice City called it something else, Camp Century. To the world, Camp Century was a bizarre, forward-looking American experiment in polar living. Films were made of it, cheerful reels with smiling soldiers in parkas, drilling through snow, cooking in mess halls, playing guitars under fluorescent lights. The Pentagon even released a documentary called City Under the Ice. But like every good spy operation, the truth lay behind the mask, and the mask was working, at least for a time. Inside Denmark, however, questions began to flicker. The Defense Intelligence Service, small and perpetually overshadowed by the CIA, noticed discrepancies. The Americans insisted Camp Century was a small, temporary scientific station. Yet the logistics told another story. Tons of steel, reactors, endless supply lines. Why would a laboratory need a nuclear reactor buried under ice? Why would research require tunneling equipment fit for mining operations? Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviets sniffed opportunity. The KGB, watching Copenhagen closely, suspected that Greenland was not what it seemed. Soviet diplomats lingered too long at embassy receptions, probing Danish officials for details. Intelligence cables from Moscow began using a term that translated roughly as the American burrow. They didn't know what was inside, not yet, but they could smell that something was hidden. The cover story began to fray almost as soon as it was sown, and the men inside Camp Century knew it too. They smiled for the cameras when journalists came, showing off their scientific experiments, their snow core samples, their radiant heaters. But when the doors closed, when the ice groaned against the walls of their tunnels, they whispered about the real mission. Not everyone was told, of course. In spycraft, secrecy is compartmentalized. A soldier digging a tunnel need not know whether he is building for science or war. But whispers travel faster than ice melts. Men in those tunnels began to wonder if the snow above their heads was meant to protect them, or to conceal something far larger. It was in those whispers that Project Iceworm began to take on a ghostly life of its own. The year was 1959. Washington buzzed with fear and calculation. The CIA had its U-2 spy planes streaking over Soviet skies, risking international scandal with every flight. American nuclear bombers circled the Arctic night, waiting for orders that, mercifully, never came. In this tense, paranoid climate, Iceworm was more than an engineering scheme. It was a gamble of deception. Could the United States hide its weapons under an ally's soil while convincing both ally and enemy that it was all in the name of science? Could a frozen desert become the cloak for the world's most lethal arsenal? Even inside the Pentagon, not everyone agreed. Some saw Iceworm as a visionary, a masterpiece of covert strategy. Others called it madness. Ice is not concrete. It shifts, it buckles, it swallows what is built upon it. But the men pushing the project were not thinking about centuries. They were thinking about the next war, the next launch, the next decade in which survival itself was uncertain. If Greenland could buy them even 5 more years of advantage, then perhaps the risk was worth it. Still, the deception had to hold. The Danes were beginning to suspect. Soviet ears were pressed against embassy walls, and in the tunnels of Camp Century, a secret reactor hummed softly under snow. It was a sound that said more than any diplomatic communique. This was not science. This was preparation. And yet, the ice has a way of keeping secrets until it doesn't. The deeper the Americans dug, the more fragile their cover became. Men spoke out of turn in Copenhagen bars. Danish engineers glimpsed schematics they should not have seen. Soviet agents filed reports, thin but troubling, about the sheer volume of American equipment being ferried north. By 1960, the question was no longer whether Project Iceworm could be hidden. It was whether it could survive exposure. And that was when the first betrayal surfaced. Not from a Soviet agent, not from a Danish diplomat, but from within. One of the officers stationed at Camp Century, his name sealed in files still partially redacted, began writing letters. Not to the Soviets, not to the Danes, but to his own wife back home. In them, he described things he should never have put on paper: the endless tunnels, the strange secrecy, the sense that they were building something other than a research station. The letters were intercepted, flagged by army censors. For a moment, panic rippled through the command. What if such a letter slipped past? What if a newspaper published it? What if the Soviets got their hands on it? The army tightened its grip, enforcing stricter male censorship, pulling men into interviews, measuring their loyalty with the cold precision of an interrogation light. Suspicion became part of daily life. Who could be trusted? Who might slip? Who might talk? That question, the eternal question of espionage, hung over Camp Century like a storm cloud, even as snow buried the roofs deeper each day. And so, Project Iceworm, still in its infancy, was already at risk of collapse, not from Soviet bombs, not from Danish outrage, but from the fragile, fallible human beings buried inside it. The ice was groaning, the cover was slipping, and yet the men in Washington pressed on, convinced that beneath the Greenland ice, the perfect hiding place still awaited. But as every spy knows, a secret is never eternal. It only waits to be found. Under the endless weight of snow and silence, there was a street no map dared to name. Men called it Main Street, though no cartographer ever traced its lines and no citizen ever strolled its length. It was carved in secret beneath a frozen desert, hidden from the world by miles of Arctic ice. At first glance, the name felt like a joke, too ordinary for the cathedral of steel and tunnels buried in white oblivion. But for the soldiers who lived there, Main Street was the only thread of civilization they clung to. And yet, what they were building was not simply a station, not just another outpost of science or exploration. It was something darker, something so veiled in lies that even most of the men driving steel spikes into the frozen walls had no idea that their home was meant to be a cage for nuclear fire. Convoys began to arrive under the cover of storms, so violent they could bury an entire truck in minutes. The planners counted on that weather, prayed for it even, because it cloaked their movement better than any camouflage net. To an unknowing eye, those vehicles carried lumber, insulation, drilling rigs, and scientific instruments for an Arctic research base. But hidden in the coded shipping manifests were crates that never saw daylight, the segmented parts of a portable nuclear reactor, wrapped in labels that read climate instruments or geological samples. Even the clerks who filed the paperwork were never told what they were actually moving. Only a handful of engineers in the Army's nuclear corps held the truth, and they spoke of it sparingly, as though words alone might betray them to the ice. On the surface, the cover story was airtight. American soldiers and Danish allies alike were told they were pioneers in polar science, exploring how men could survive and thrive on the ice sheet, mapping unknown geology, testing human endurance against brutal cold. The brochures looked impressive, the diplomatic cables well rehearsed. Yet, inside the tunnels, under flickering fluorescent bulbs and the constant groan of shifting ice overhead, some soldiers began to wonder why they were laying tracks wide enough to pull trains of heavy equipment, or why Main Street had to be reinforced with steel strong enough to support the weight of armored convoys. A laboratory was one thing, but why would a laboratory need a street? The secret had many faces and even more shadows. Those shadows stretched far beyond the ice, reaching into the marble corridors of embassies and intelligence residenturas. In Copenhagen, a Soviet resident, the chief KGB officer, stationed under diplomatic cover, had begun intercepting whispers. A Danish contractor, drunk in the wrong tavern, had bragged about supplying specialized insulation for a nuclear station in the Arctic. The word nuclear was enough to set Moscow's blood racing. Was it an early warning radar to blind their bombers? A missile station aimed at the heart of the Soviet Union? Or something even more monstrous, launch sites buried in ice, invisible to reconnaissance? Moscow's paranoia was not misplaced. In the world of the Cold War, any whisper could mean a new threat was already being assembled. And so, the quiet war began. Soviet operatives circled like wolves in the streets of Copenhagen, angling toward Danish scientists and contractors who had signed on to America's scientific project. A dinner invitation here, a misplaced question there, a casual drink bought for a lonely researcher who longed to talk about his Arctic work. The Danes themselves felt the heat. Their intelligence service, small and cautious, began filing uneasy reports. We fear Denmark is being used as a silent partner in a project with implications not yet disclosed. But what could they do? Their nation relied on American protection, and questioning Washington too loudly risked exposing them as an unfaithful ally in NATO. Silence was safer. At least, it seemed so. For the soldiers who lived beneath the ice, the war was not in whispered parlors or coded telegrams, but in the groaning walls that never stopped moving. They heard the tunnels crack at night, like bones splintering under pressure. They felt the air thicken when the generator slowed, reminding them that without constant electricity, they would suffocate in darkness. Main Street became their lifeline, lined with barracks, kitchens, chapels, and the warm hum of the nuclear reactor disguised as a scientific power unit. They played baseball in its frozen corridors, sent letters home describing the wonders of life in a subterranean town, but they never spoke of the parts of the base sealed off with reinforced doors, guarded not by locks, but by silence. One man remembered hearing a captain mutter, "This place isn't just for science, it's a skeleton waiting for flesh." But when he pressed him, the officer laughed it off. Still, the soldier noticed the captain's hand tremble when he lit his cigarette. The truth seeped into the minds of many there, but no one dared say it aloud. Secrets that large had a way of crushing men the same way the ice pressed in from above, slowly, invisibly, without mercy. While the men underground fought with claustrophobia and creeping suspicion, their invisible adversaries maneuvered above ground. Soviet intelligence began compiling fragments, an unusual shipment of graphite moderators, Danish scientists who suddenly had their travel papers restricted, rumors of Americans constructing tunnels large enough to house trains. Moscow ordered its resident to probe deeper. If it was radar, they could counter it. If it was missiles, they needed to know, fast. To the KGB, Greenland's silence felt like a wound that might already be bleeding. Denmark's own officials grew anxious. They had allowed American bases on their soil, but nuclear weapons were a red line, one the government had quietly promised the public it would never cross. Yet, their American allies spoke vaguely of reactors for research purposes and brushed off further inquiries. The Danes filed memos that gathered dust in locked cabinets, afraid to press the issue, but unable to ignore the gnawing suspicion that their sovereignty was being undermined. It was the kind of tension that could tear an alliance apart if exposed, but as long as it remained in shadows, it only grew more toxic. Inside Camp Century, the men kept digging, kept reinforcing, kept expanding. They gave their frozen town names to remind themselves of home: Main Street, Copenhagen Avenue, Washington Boulevard. Yet, beneath those names was the knowledge that everything they built might one day house something more terrifying than homesickness could explain. A city designed not for life, but for war. And then came the first signs that their secret was slipping. A Danish scientist, approached at a quiet cafe by a man who claimed to admire his work, returned home shaken and filed a report to his ministry. The man had known too much, asked about reactor safety, about tunnel lengths. He had smiled too warmly, left too quickly. Within days, the report had reached Danish counterintelligence, which in turn discreetly alerted the Americans. The CIA knew instantly what it meant. The Soviets were circling closer, sniffing the edges of the ice. But what the CIA didn't know was how much Moscow already suspected, or how far they were willing to go to uncover the truth. The ice had ears now, and in Copenhagen, the resident's hand was already moving pieces on a chessboard whose final shape the men beneath the glacier could not yet imagine. Main Street was alive with laughter, arguments, and the hollow echo of footsteps in frozen tunnels. But above all that hum, there was a new vibration, a frequency only a few men could sense. It was the sound of Moscow's gaze, cold and unblinking, settling on the glacier like a predator's eyes in the dark. And as that gaze locked onto Greenland's hidden fortress, the question was no longer whether the secret would hold, but when the first crack would appear and what would happen when it finally split wide open. Beneath the frozen silence of Greenland's endless white horizon, a vision took root that would blur the line between engineering ambition and espionage fantasy, a plan so audacious that it read like something torn from the pages of a Cold War spy thriller rather than a military feasibility report. The hook of the story is this. At the very moment the world's attention seemed locked on Berlin, Cuba, and the deserts of the Middle East, the United States Army was secretly drafting blueprints for a subterranean empire of missiles stretching for 52,000 square miles under the ice cap, a labyrinth that would make Greenland's frozen heart the most dangerous piece of real estate on Earth. It was called Project Iceworm, and on paper it promised to turn an Arctic wasteland into the most impregnable nuclear fortress mankind had ever conceived. But to bring this dream into the shadows of reality meant that the entire effort had to be wrapped in the camouflage of science, hidden behind the smiling faces of young engineers drilling research tunnels, and protected by an intelligence screen that ran from Copenhagen to Washington. The blueprint was staggering. Not a single launch site, nor even a handful, but 600 nuclear missiles mounted on mobile rail platforms deep beneath the glacier, shuttling silently through tunnels that would stretch thousands of miles in shifting geometric patterns so that the Soviets could never pinpoint their locations. 60 command centers hidden in reinforced vaults of ice, each one capable of giving the order to fire, their power drawn from reactors concealed in white domes that, to the untrained eye, looked like meteorological stations. It was not just a weapons system, it was a city within a glacier, one designed to be as invisible as the air itself. American planners spoke in coded phrases, talking about a subsurface grid or Arctic hardening, but what they meant was something darker, a second strike guarantee buried in a land so remote that even Soviet bombers could not hope to reach it. To them, the idea seemed untouchable. To the Soviets, if it were ever discovered, it would be a nightmare. The genius of the plan lay not only in its scale, but in its secrecy. Every shipment of steel, every spool of cable, every reactor part moved under cover of Arctic storms, slipped onto manifests labeled as research equipment. Convoys moved at night, disappearing into the snow, while code words hummed through encrypted radios. The very ice itself was their cloak, ensuring that satellites, still primitive in their coverage, could not peer through the blizzards. But the flaw in the American logic was as old as the Cold War itself. Nothing stayed secret forever, especially not when spies were listening. In Copenhagen, a Soviet resident received a report from an asset within the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs who claimed to have overheard talk of an American nuclear station in Greenland. The words were vague, the context unclear, but to Moscow's analysts it sounded like the whisper of a weapon they had not yet accounted for. KGB analysts pored over the data like chess masters staring at a new gambit. Why were supply ships bound for Thule Air Base suddenly making additional stops? Why did U.S. Army Engineering Corps requisition specialized drilling machines normally used for deep mining operations? Why were Danish scientists, usually open in their research, suddenly guarded in their correspondence with colleagues in Oslo and Stockholm? The Soviets knew that Washington had a taste for deception, but this pattern was too irregular, too specific to ignore. In the Kremlin's shadowed halls, the speculation began. Were the Americans building an Arctic radar wall, or something more sinister? Perhaps even a missile arsenal buried beneath the ice. The paranoia was not unfounded. The world had just witnessed the Cuban Missile Crisis, and every intelligence service was on edge, ready to detect the faintest sign of nuclear treachery. Soviet operatives in Denmark sharpened their focus. They began targeting young Danish geologists who had been invited to consult with the Americans on glaciology. One such scientist, a doctoral student from Aarhus, found himself suddenly courted by men who introduced themselves as journalists, but whose questions had nothing to do with science and everything to do with tunnels, excavation depths, and the endurance of ice under pressure. Across Copenhagen's smoky cafes and discreet hotel bars, Moscow's operatives hunted for scraps of information, convinced that Greenland hid something the Americans desperately wanted to keep invisible. Meanwhile, on the glacier itself, the soldiers knew nothing of this larger game. Their letters home painted the picture of a strange but adventurous duty station, temperatures that could kill in minutes, tunnels that groaned under shifting ice, and machines that choked and froze in the cold. They spoke of camaraderie, of playing cards in prefabricated huts, of drilling for climate research. Only a handful of engineers and officers knew the truth, that the grid they were carving into the glacier was not meant for science, but for missiles. And even those men, bound by classification, could never speak of the larger dream, that one day, beneath their boots, a rolling arsenal of 600 nuclear warheads would glide along hidden tracks, waiting for the order to launch. For those who conceived it, the beauty of Iceworm lay in its plausibility. To the world, the US was engaged in polar science, a continuation of its International Geophysical Year commitments. To Denmark, the project was merely an extension of American research into cold weather survival. And to the soldiers, it was just another outpost in the long, weary chess game of the Cold War. But deep in the Pentagon's classified vaults, the documents told another story, of a continent within a continent, a frozen kingdom of death designed to assure that, even if Soviet missiles struck first, America could strike back from a place no one would think to look. The KGB's suspicions grew with every intercepted cable. Reports of specialized concrete ordered for Thule, shipments of prefabricated steel arches, and whispers of a nuclear reactor component shipped under diplomatic cover all pointed towards something vast and hidden. One Soviet analyst scrawled a note in the margin of his report. "This is not research. This is deployment." The fear in Moscow was not just of the weapons themselves, but of the precedent. If the Americans could turn Greenland's ice cap into a hidden missile farm, then nowhere in the world was safe from similar deception. The paranoia escalated. Orders were given to expand agent networks, to press harder against Denmark's fragile neutrality, to peel back the layers of American secrecy no matter the risk. In Washington, a different kind of anxiety brewed. Counterintelligence reports indicated unusual Soviet interest in Greenland, more than the ice and rocks could ever justify. Memos circulated warning that Moscow was probing Danish universities and targeting engineers. The CIA quietly asked its Danish counterparts to increase surveillance, though Denmark's politicians bristled at the suggestion that their universities were compromised. Yet, even as they protested, quiet fears lingered in Copenhagen's parliament. Had the Americans built something on their soil that was not merely research, but a nuclear tinderbox that could drag their country into war? The dream of Iceworm was intoxicating to the strategists who nurtured it. They envisioned a subterranean system where missiles rolled endlessly along steel rails, never in the same place twice, immune to a Soviet first strike. Command centers buried beneath 30 feet of ice, staffed by officers who could launch a counterattack even if Washington itself lay in ruins. A fortress so concealed that it could exist for decades without enemy eyes ever finding it. Yet, in the back of every planner's mind was a truth they preferred not to voice. The ice was alive. It shifted, it groaned, it moved at rates unpredictable even to the most skilled glaciologists. Could a city of steel and missiles truly survive beneath such a restless surface? For the moment, those doubts were buried as deep as the tunnels themselves, hidden beneath classified stamps and hopeful assumptions. And so, the stage was set. The Americans continued digging, expanding, drawing their lines on maps of ice, convinced they were building an untraceable arsenal. The Soviets sharpened their intelligence knives, following the supply chains, pressing their agents, determined to pierce the veil. The soldiers kept drilling, writing cheerful letters about scientific drills, unaware that they were pawns in a game of nuclear deception more audacious than any they could imagine. And in Copenhagen, Danish officials, caught between the promises of their American allies and the whispers of their Soviet adversaries, wondered how long they could remain blind to the truth. It was a dream, perhaps even a hallucination, of perfect concealment, of nuclear invulnerability, of a second strike weapon buried in the ice. But dreams have a way of colliding with reality. And as the Cold War deepened, the very secret that America believed would make it untouchable was already unraveling. One intercepted message, one suspicious shipment, one whisper at a Danish cafe at a time. The question was no longer whether Iceworm could be built. The question was whether its secret could survive long enough to matter. The hum was faint, steady, and almost soothing, but in that frozen expanse beneath Greenland's ice, it was also the most dangerous sound in the world. For those stationed in the labyrinth of tunnels, the heartbeat of the reactor was a reminder of life itself, keeping the underground city warm, lit, and functioning in a place where the temperature outside could snap steel like twigs. Yet, to the men who understood the true scope of Project Iceworm, the low vibration was more than a comfort. It was a risk, a beacon, a pulse that might one day be heard not only by them, but by ears thousands of miles away in Moscow. The moment the first atom split beneath the ice, the dream of a hidden nuclear fortress became not just bold, but perilously fragile, its existence balanced on secrecy, silence, and the hope that the Soviets would never learn what lay beneath the endless white sheets of Greenland's glaciers. It was never meant to be just an engineering project. For the planners in Washington, the reactor was the beating core of a clandestine arsenal, a power source that could sustain the sprawling underground network necessary to house hundreds of missiles. Without it, the dream of Iceworm would remain a fantasy on paper. With it, however, came the one element espionage could sniff out, the kind of anomaly Soviet analysts were trained to detect: unexplained supply shipments, irregular energy flows, whispers of radiation in places where no reactor should exist. It was not merely a tool of progress, it was a signal fire, invisible to the eye, but detectable to the right kind of suspicion. Inside the icy tunnels, soldiers wrote to their families about drilling, surveying, and the monotony of life in the Arctic, their letters carefully scrubbed of any classified detail. They described it as an experiment in cold weather survival, a quirky mission for the curious minds of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. None of them mentioned the steel container humming beneath their boots, the carefully monitored rods glowing within, or the reality that they were living above a potential catastrophe. A failure inside those walls would not just mean the death of the crew, but could contaminate the very ice sheets that stretched across Greenland, poisoning a landscape thought to be untouchable by human folly. The irony was bitter. The reactor was the source of life for Iceworm, but it was also the most fragile element of the entire design, the secret that could unravel everything. Back in Europe, Soviet operatives began asking questions. The CIA station in Copenhagen flagged an intercepted cable with a chillingly simple inquiry sent from Moscow Center to a field operative. Is America constructing missile silos in Greenland? To most, it might have seemed a vague question, another routine probe in the chess game of Cold War paranoia. But to those aware of Project Iceworm's true ambition, it was a thunderclap, proof that the Soviets had caught the faintest scent of something unusual happening far beneath the Arctic winds. How had they guessed? Was it a careless word from a soldier on leave, a supply shipment tracked by Soviet agents watching European ports, or the curious fact that American engineers seemed unusually interested in ice core samples? Suspicion, once seated, grew quickly. The KGB's scientific directorate theorized that only a nuclear reactor could power something vast enough to warrant such hidden activity. To them, the possibility that the United States was tunneling beneath the ice to install a concealed launch system was not absurd. It was terrifyingly logical. Soviet satellites of the era could not peer beneath the glacier's surface, but they could track patterns. Ships from U.S. ports carrying unusual cargo made odd detours, equipment disappeared from military inventories, and fuel rations meant for northern bases spiked unexpectedly. Each anomaly was a clue, and in Moscow, analysts began assembling the puzzle with a quiet dread. For Washington, the fear was not that the Soviets had proof, but that they had suspicion. Suspicion was enough to trigger questions at the United Nations, enough to pressure Denmark into demanding answers it might not have wanted to hear, enough to raise the nightmare of a Soviet preemptive strike should they believe that Greenland was transforming into a nuclear dagger pointed at their heart. The United States needed the reactor to remain invisible, not only physically, but in every political and psychological sense. One leak of information, one careless whisper, and the fragile balance of secrecy would shatter. Even within the project itself, unease grew. Engineers spoke in hushed tones about the reactor, noting how the ice around it creaked and shifted, as if the glacier itself resisted the intrusion of man's most dangerous invention. Radiation sensors were checked obsessively, logs updated with a precision that bordered on paranoia. Some nights, soldiers swore they could hear the groaning of the ice amplified by the tunnels, like the glacier whispering its disapproval of the atomic heartbeat buried within it. Men who entered the reactor's chamber often emerged pale, not from radiation exposure, but from the unshakable awareness that they were standing in the center of a secret that could alter the fate of the Cold War if it ever escaped. In Moscow, the whispers thickened. Reports filtered through double agents and intercepted communications, rumors of a reactor buried under Greenland. Soviet intelligence officers debated whether it was propaganda, misdirection, or a genuine lead. Some dismissed it as an exaggeration, while others insisted it was the key to understanding America's Arctic obsession. Meanwhile, the CIA's European stations kept intercepting fragments of questions, fragments that hinted at an accelerating Soviet effort to confirm the truth. Each intercepted cable was like hearing footsteps on the stairs in a dark house. You did not know if the intruder was truly coming for you, but every creak grew louder in your imagination. Diplomats, too, began to feel the pressure. If Denmark ever learned of the reactor's existence, it would spark a political storm. Greenland, though strategically invaluable, was still Danish territory, and no treaty openly allowed the United States to bury a nuclear reactor in its ice. The scandal alone could rupture NATO unity at a time when the alliance was already stretched thin. The planners knew it, the engineers felt it, and the soldiers who had sworn oaths to secrecy lived with it. The reactor was not just humming beneath their feet, it was ticking, a clock counting down to the moment the secret could no longer be contained. What haunted the men in both Washington and Greenland was not the possibility of discovery alone, but the consequences if the Soviets chose to act on suspicion rather than confirmation. In the Cold War, waiting for proof was a luxury. If Moscow became convinced that a nuclear arsenal was being assembled under the ice, they might not hesitate to strike first, long before a single missile could emerge from its subterranean cradle. The dream of Iceworm was supposed to be a shield, but the reactor had transformed it into a target. Every hum of that atomic heartbeat was a reminder of survival, but also of exposure. Every intercepted Soviet cable tightened the noose around the secret city's neck, and deep beneath the ice, in tunnels carved by ambition and guarded by silence, men carried on their work with the dreadful awareness that the very power sustaining them might one day give them away. The ice above remained indifferent, silent, and immense, but the world beyond was listening more closely with every passing day. The ice was never still. It groaned in the silence of the tunnels, a low, almost imperceptible rumble, like the stomach of the earth itself, shifting uneasily beneath the weight of human ambition. At first, the men dismissed it as the natural voice of Greenland's eternal glacier, an ancient sound that had carried on long before they arrived with drills and steel beams. But as the weeks wore on, the glacier began to move against them. The ceilings sagged, the support arches bent, and at times the ice collapsed in sudden, violent bursts, showering men with frozen shards sharp enough to tear through clothing and skin. Every collapse was another reminder that their fortress was not a fortress at all, but a temporary pocket carved inside a living, moving enemy. Yet still, they dug deeper, patched walls with plywood and steel, reinforced beams, and told themselves the ice could be tamed. They knew it was a lie. The danger was no longer just structural, it was psychological. A whisper circulated among the men, not about frostbite or avalanches, but about the sound of boots echoing in the tunnels when no one else was there, shadows glimpsed at the edge of lantern light, the feeling of being watched in a place where no intruder should exist. Some chalked it up to nerves and isolation, others to the crushing weight of secrecy they had been ordered to bear. But paranoia, once seated, does not stay contained. Far above, the Soviets were already watching. Their reconnaissance planes swept across the Arctic in cold, methodical arcs, lenses trained on any unusual disturbance in the endless white. One flight captured tracks etched into the snow near the supposed science camp, trails too linear, too patterned, too deliberate to belong to mere supply sleds. Moscow's analysts scrutinized the images with a hunter's patience, asking themselves what kind of research left behind tire imprints that matched military transports. The answer they whispered among themselves was not geology, it was weaponry. In Langley, intercepted Soviet traffic confirmed their suspicions. Buried inside stiff, coded phrasing, one phrase kept surfacing: "Is America constructing missile silos in Greenland?" The question carried more weight than ink on paper. If the Soviets believed the US had hidden nuclear launch sites within striking distance of Moscow, they might preempt, striking not with words, but with fire. The reactor under the ice was already a secret balanced on a razor's edge. One careless footprint in the snow could tip it into catastrophe. The CIA responded with a blend of improvisation and deception. Patrol routes across the ice were rewritten in cipher, changed daily so that no Soviet overflight could establish a reliable pattern. Airmen were instructed to erase tracks with drags behind their snow tractors, disguising movement as the work of drifting winds. Reports were leaked. false scientific papers describing Camp Century's experiments as benign, focused only on climate, ice cores, and the study of polar weather. These were published in respected journals, then discreetly mailed towards Soviet bloc contacts, the goal being to drown suspicion under a flood of carefully planted normalcy. But inside the tunnels, the men saw another reality. They were told to remain silent about collapses, to bury their injuries under official optimism. One sergeant, half his scalp torn by falling ice, was ordered to describe the accident as a drilling mishap. Another, with a shattered arm, was quietly transferred home without explanation. Yet, still the accidents mounted, the walls groaning louder, the ceilings sagging lower. For the men who lay awake at night in narrow bunks, the question was not only whether the Soviets would find them, it was whether the ice itself was trying to kill them. The soldiers and engineers began to trade stories in whispers. Why, they asked, would a weather station require such intense security? Coded patrol routes, armed escorts on resupply convoys, and constant monitoring of Soviet transmissions. Why were the scientists so nervous, so quick to quiet conversations if anyone mentioned radiation or reactors? Rumors festered in the darkness like mold, that they were living above something far more dangerous than they were told, that their mission was not about weather at all, but war. The paranoia was not unfounded. Intelligence reports warned of the possibility that Soviet special forces could infiltrate Greenland disguised as scientists, explorers, or even Danish officials. The vast emptiness of the Arctic provided perfect cover. A handful of men with skis and radios could track movements, photograph convoys, even sabotage the delicate reactor buried beneath their feet. To counter the threat, counterintelligence officers drafted elaborate disinformation campaigns. Radio chatter seeded with false coordinates, coded references to non-existent ice core experiments, patrol logs that suggested activity miles from the real reactor site. A spy who intercepted any of these would walk into a trap of snow and silence. But even as Washington tried to outmaneuver Moscow in shadows and signals, nature remained the most relentless spy of all. The glacier shifted without allegiance, without ideology, grinding slowly, but with an unstoppable force. In one particularly grim collapse, a support arch gave way during a meal, sending men scrambling from the mess hall as ice thundered down in a choking cloud of frost. No one was killed that day, but the message was clear. The base was temporary, no matter how much steel and secrecy they buried inside it. Morale frayed. Some men wrote letters home they knew would never pass censors, pouring their doubts into words that would be blacked out by thick markers before delivery. Others drank in secret, rationing whiskey hidden behind fuel drums. A few stared too long at the walls, hearing in their creaks and cracks the whisper of a truth they could not speak, that the ice did not want them there. Meanwhile, the Soviets pressed harder. Each overflight carried the risk of discovery. Each intercepted cable hinted at how close Moscow was to unraveling the cover story. One particularly chilling message from the KGB to its operatives in Europe carried only a single line: confirm or deny the reactor under Greenland. If such confirmation were ever obtained, the fragile balance of the Cold War could tilt toward confrontation. The Americans knew it, and the men in the tunnels felt it. They lived each day under a double siege, from the glacier above and from the invisible enemy circling in the skies beyond. And in that pressure cooker of secrecy and survival, the question sharpened into a blade that cut at every soldier's nerves. If this was only science, why did it feel like war? Imagine the kind of cold that makes words stick in your throat, where breath itself turns to a white cloud that feels like it carries secrets. That was the cold pressing down over Greenland in those years. But beneath the snow, there was another kind of chill, the frost of suspicion creeping across oceans and into quiet embassies. What had begun as whispers among Danish officials, nothing more than murmurs behind closed doors, fragments of rumors exchanged in low tones, was now crystallizing into something more dangerous. Denmark had been told that Camp Century was nothing more than a bold scientific experiment, a triumph of ingenuity and cooperation between allies. But cables had begun to move across desks in Copenhagen, stamped with words that burned hotter than fire against the frozen silence. Highly sensitive. These were not the kinds of documents written to explain weather experiments. They carried the pulse of fear, of betrayal, of the question that no one wanted to speak aloud. Had the Americans placed nuclear weapons on Danish soil? In secret, under the ice, in defiance of Denmark's nuclear-free policy? The story was breaking free of the snowdrifts. And once suspicion had taken root, it spread like cracks through the ice. Inside the tunnels of Camp Century, the men already lived with the creaks and groans of a world trying to bury them alive. They told themselves the sounds came from the ice shifting, which was true, but they knew too that every groan carried the echo of another truth. People were watching. Someone far away, perhaps from Moscow, perhaps from Copenhagen, perhaps even from Washington itself, wanted to know what was really happening under that frozen plateau. To the soldiers, secrecy was normal, but the security drills had become harsher, more rehearsed, less like science, and more like the routines of a fort preparing for siege. They were instructed not to speak too openly in letters home, to avoid even the word nuclear in conversation with their own comrades unless the officer gave permission. Men began to suspect each other of talking too much, of being careless, of letting a word slip where it could not be contained. And yet, above this human paranoia, the greater paranoia was beginning to crack open thousands of miles away in Denmark. In Copenhagen, Danish officials sifted through reports that contradicted each other. On one page, American diplomats reassured them that the Arctic base was purely about scientific discovery, about studying glaciers, about preparing for the future of exploration. But another page, delivered through quieter channels, suggested there was more. Whispers said there were nuclear components, reactors perhaps, or weapons themselves, hidden in the frozen tunnels. Some diplomats believed it could not be true, that the Americans would not dare violate Denmark's sovereignty so blatantly. Others, however, recalled the tone of US briefings, always evasive, always cloaked in language that gave more comfort than detail. A cable marked "highly sensitive" summed up the dilemma. If the Americans were lying, Denmark would either have to expose them and risk fracturing NATO unity at the height of the Cold War, or stay silent and allow its people to live unknowingly with nuclear devices beneath their soil. The CIA understood this tension. It understood it with the precision of a blade, because it had long practiced the art of managing allies, keeping them reassured, even deceived, when greater strategic interests demanded it. American diplomats who traveled to Copenhagen in those days did not arrive empty-handed. They carried with them carefully crafted reassurances, lines written and rehearsed in rooms in Washington, where intelligence officers sat shoulder to shoulder with policy advisors. Camp Century is exactly what we said it is, they told their Danish counterparts, a marvel of Arctic engineering, a joint commitment to science. What they did not say was that beneath the hum of generators and the glow of fluorescent lights, engineers were testing theories about how nuclear missiles could be hidden beneath the ice, moved on rails, concealed from Soviet satellites. The lies were delivered with warmth, with handshakes, with the kind of sincerity that only men trained to deceive could summon, and yet the Danish officials sensed the hollowness beneath the words. Espionage, in this moment, was not only about Soviet agents circling the Arctic skies. It was about the battle between allies, the shadow games played between supposed friends who shared treaties but not truths. Danish intelligence began to probe discreetly, but even there they faced walls. For every question asked, an answer came back too smoothly. For every suspicion raised, another American explanation was supplied. Too neat, too clean, too rehearsed. There were men in Copenhagen who swore they could hear the falseness in the American reassurances, like a violin string just slightly out of tune. And yet, Denmark was small. America was vast. To push too hard was to risk everything: aid, military support, the very credibility of the alliance holding Western Europe together against the Soviet threat. Meanwhile, Moscow was not blind to these cracks. Soviet intelligence thrived on fault lines, and they knew how to press them. Declassified notes suggest that Soviet operatives, watching from afar, considered ways to widen the distrust. What if they could leak just enough information to make Denmark believe the worst? What if NATO's unity could be cracked not with missiles, but with rumors? The Cold War was built on these games: disinformation and counter-disinformation, allies questioning allies, and men walking through the snow, wondering if the sound they heard was simply the wind or the footfall of an enemy who wore the uniform of a friend. Inside Camp Century, the soldiers began to notice subtle changes in their orders. Patrol routes were altered frequently, and sometimes they were told not to follow the map they had studied the day before. At first, it seemed like routine adjustments, but then they were told why. Or rather, they were told a lie that felt too purposeful. Soviet infiltrators, the officers claimed, could attempt to cross Greenland's icy expanses to spy on them, perhaps even to sabotage the base. The men laughed at first, because the idea seemed absurd. How could anyone cross hundreds of miles of Arctic wilderness undetected? But when they laughed, the officers did not. Instead, they issued new codes, instructed the men to vary their paths, to report any tracks in the snow that seemed unusual. Suddenly, every mark on the endless white surface became suspicious. A trail that could have belonged to a fox became the imagined print of a boot. A snowdrift disturbed by wind became the trace of a hidden saboteur. Paranoia, once planted, spread quickly. Letters from some of the soldiers show the tension that was growing. One wrote that he had begun to suspect that there was more to the camp than he had been told, that the secrecy and the security made no sense for a science station. He dared not say more, not even in the letter, but his words were enough to reveal the unease. Another soldier wrote that the sound of planes passing overhead no longer made him think of resupply flights. Instead, he imagined Soviet eyes staring down, watching, taking note of the strange lines carved into the ice, where tractors and sledges moved in patterns that only made sense if you knew what was being tested below. And then came the overflights. Soviet aircraft cruising high over the Arctic, not always close enough to breach sovereignty, but close enough to be noticed. Each time one appeared on the horizon, the Americans at Camp Century stiffened, for they knew that the tracks in the snow, the tunnels carved below, the very existence of the camp, might not look so innocent from above. Some swore the Soviets were photographing the area, trying to piece together the puzzle of what the Americans were doing. Whether they were or not hardly mattered. The fear that they were was enough. It added another layer to the suffocating secrecy that now clung to every word spoken in the tunnels. Back in Denmark, debates grew sharper. One official is said to have remarked in private, "If they have done this, if they have placed weapons on our soil, then we are not their ally, but their pawn." The words were never meant to reach Washington, but suspicions did. American intelligence intercepted whispers of Denmark's growing anger, and so the coaching intensified. More reassurances, more handshakes, more words written by men who knew the art of keeping allies in the dark. But with each reassurance came more silence, more stonewalling, more refusal to answer the questions at the heart of the matter. The tension became unbearable because everyone involved knew that exposure would not only embarrass the United States, it would break trust in NATO at a moment when the Soviets waited for any fracture to exploit. The Americans chose silence, and silence is sometimes the loudest answer of all. Denmark prepared to confront Washington quietly, ready to ask the questions it had been circling for months. But when the confrontation came, when the words were finally placed on the table in a room that smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the Americans did not yield. They stonewalled, giving nothing, acknowledging nothing, and leaving Denmark with only suspicions, never proof. And so the secret remained, buried beneath the snow, for the time being. But like the ice itself, it was always shifting, always threatening to crack. Denmark's suspicion had become part of the story, part of the espionage game being played not only between East and West, but within the very alliance meant to protect them both. The betrayal was not the kind found in spy novels where a man hands over a folder in a shadowed alley. It was the quieter kind, the betrayal of silence, the withholding of truth between friends. And in the cold, beneath the snow, that silence was more dangerous than any sound. Beneath the frozen silence of Greenland, where winds whip across an endless horizon of white and the weight of the ice has smothered secrets for millennia, the American experiment at Camp Century was reaching its breaking point. What began as a bold plan to carve a nuclear missile grid beneath the Arctic had mutated into something darker, an engineering failure colliding with the psychology of espionage. By the mid-1960s, the cracks were no longer metaphorical. The tunnels themselves were sagging, buckling under the relentless glacial pressure. The very medium chosen to conceal America's nuclear ambition, the ice itself, was now devouring it. Engineers who had once described the labyrinth as a marvel began whispering in confidential reports that sections of the base could collapse without warning. Every sound, every groan of the ice became a reminder that time was running out. And yet, what chilled Washington more than the cold itself was the question of what would happen if the truth slipped out with it. Meetings at the Pentagon took on a new intensity. By 1966, the discussions were no longer about whether Project Iceworm could succeed, but how it could be dismantled without leaving fingerprints. The stakes were not simply diplomatic embarrassment. The entire premise of NATO unity was built on trust, and if Denmark discovered the extent of the deception, that nuclear weapons had been schemed beneath their sovereign territory without their knowledge, the fallout could unravel alliances at the height of the Cold War. Memos stamped "Eyes Only" circled between the CIA and military brass, debating how to handle the collapse. Some argued that a clean withdrawal would suffice, that ice would bury the evidence forever. Others, more cautious, warned that leaving behind waste or even faint traces of nuclear material would become a time bomb of its own, waiting for the day when Greenland thawed enough for someone else to uncover the ruins. The most sensitive item was the reactor. The portable nuclear unit that had powered Camp Century's underground city had become a liability. Engineers planned and executed its removal with surgical precision, crating it up in secrecy and shipping it away under layers of classified cover stories. On the surface, official reports painted the closure as routine. The ice had proven too unstable for long-term research, so the Americans were scaling back operations. What those reports did not mention was that alongside the reactor, vast amounts of toxic waste, including chemical coolants, fuel, and PCBs, were left entombed beneath the snow. Files note discussions about whether to extract them, but concluded that recovery was logistically impossible and politically unnecessary. The reasoning was brutally simple. The ice would hold forever. No one would ever look beneath. Inside Langley, the CIA prepared the cover-up with the same meticulous precision it devoted to covert coups and clandestine operations. Diplomats were handed talking points, rehearsed in briefing rooms where phrases like routine closure and budgetary constraints became shields against suspicion. Files were stamped classified at the highest levels, hidden in vaults so deep that even decades later, researchers would struggle to find traces of the real story. The mantra was consistent: deny, deflect, bury. The irony was impossible to ignore. The most dangerous secrets of the nuclear age were now literally buried under tons of snow and ice. Meanwhile, Soviet analysts were watching. Signals intelligence intercepted chatter of closures, supply withdrawals, sudden American flights into Tula. Moscow's interpretation was not that the project had failed, but that the Americans had perfected something worth hiding. KGB dossiers speculated that beneath Greenland still lay a functioning grid of launch sites, perhaps even a second reactor, shielded by the Arctic. From the Soviet perspective, it made no sense that Washington would abandon such a bold project without leaving behind a functioning prototype. The paranoia that defined the Cold War was now inverted. While the Americans feared discovery of a failure, the Soviets feared the existence of a hidden success. Back in Denmark, whispers trickled through diplomatic circles. A handful of officials noticed discrepancies in the timelines and budgets reported by the US Embassy. Danish intelligence scribbled quiet notes in classified files, flagging that the Americans had sealed sections of Camp Century without explanation. The words "highly sensitive" and "treaty implications" began to appear in cables exchanged between Copenhagen and Washington. But every inquiry met a wall of stone-faced denials. To admit even partial truth would have triggered a scandal capable of ripping through NATO, so the Americans chose silence, knowing the Danes had little leverage against their superpower ally. In 1967, the last men walked out of the tunnels. Snow already filled in the spaces where dormitories and laboratories had once buzzed with life. The ice reclaimed it with eerie efficiency, as if it too wanted the secret hidden. Yet, what lay beneath was not erased but entombed: barrels of chemical waste, radioactive residues, and the architectural bones of a covert city meant to house nuclear missiles. Each layer of snow became not just insulation, but a veil of deception. And so Camp Century, and with it Project Iceworm, was folded into the Cold War's deepest shadows. For the public, it became a footnote, spoken of only as a quirky Cold War research station. For Denmark, it was a question never fully answered. For the Soviets, it remained a ghost project that haunted their intelligence assessments for decades. And for the CIA, it became a file to lock away, a risk managed by silence. But silence has its own dangers. As the ice slowly shifts and melts, scientists now warn that the toxins left behind could one day seep into the environment, turning a Cold War secret into a modern ecological disaster. The cover-up, once flawless, now trembles with the possibility of exposure, not from spies or diplomats, but from the Earth itself. Which leaves one final question looming in the shadows. Did America bury a failure, or did it bury one of the most dangerous nuclear secrets in the Arctic, hoping that no one would ever look beneath the snow? The wind over Greenland in the 1990s still howled with the same glacial indifference as it had 3 decades earlier, but history had shifted. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the secrets once thought locked away forever inside the vaults of Washington and Langley began to loosen, one classified stamp at a time. Yet, as the ink of redactions bled across thousands of once forbidden pages, what emerged was not just a story of hidden tunnels and abandoned ambitions. It was the revelation of betrayal, deception, and a buried nuclear shadow stretching from Washington to Copenhagen, from Moscow's intelligence corridors to the quiet, wind-swept settlements of Greenland. The hook was immediate. A handful of declassified memos contained language so blunt, so damning, that when Danish officials first read them, it was as if the ground beneath their feet had given way. One memo, dated in the early 1960s, coolly stated that the United States had no intention of informing Denmark of the true purpose of Camp Century, and that any inquiry from Copenhagen would be met with carefully orchestrated lies. This was not the fog of war, nor the ambiguity of military necessity. It was the deliberate construction of a false reality, a deception carried out against an ally who believed it was in on the game. For Denmark, the revelation landed like an earthquake. Through the Cold War years, they had been assured that Greenland, though strategically important, was not being turned into a nuclear staging ground without their knowledge. And yet, as documents trickled out in the 1990s, that assurance was shattered. The words were unambiguous. Danish authorities must not be informed. The Danish parliament reacted with fury, some demanding immediate explanations from Washington, others quietly asking the darker question: if the United States had lied so openly and so easily, how many other lies had been told? For the Greenlandic people, who had never been consulted at all, the outrage burned even deeper. Their homeland had nearly become a radioactive tomb, a graveyard of waste and poison locked in ice, all without their knowledge, without their consent. But the revelations were only partial. What surfaced in the 1990s was the sanitized version of Project Iceworm, carefully stripped of its most volatile details. The CIA, still masters of controlled disclosure, ensured that the full dimensions of the scheme remained cloaked in black bars and withheld files. Yet even the fragments that reached daylight were enough to paint a picture of systematic deceit. Analysts in Europe began piecing together scraps: the ice tunnels, the reactor, the idea of launching nuclear missiles from beneath the Arctic. Each piece confirmed what had once been whispered in Soviet circles, but never fully believed. Indeed, in Moscow's archives after the Soviet Union's collapse, researchers stumbled upon KGB intelligence reports from the 1960s. They revealed that Soviet analysts had suspected Iceworm's existence, though they never managed to verify it. One chilling line from a 1965 report noted that American activity in Greenland suggests preparation for nuclear deployment under cover of scientific research. It had been treated with caution at the time, filed under unconfirmed, and overshadowed by more urgent crises in Cuba and Vietnam. But now, in the 1990s, those once dismissed suspicions looked eerily prescient. The Soviets had seen the shadow of the monster beneath the ice, even if they had never grasped its full shape. The suspense deepened as more files surfaced in Denmark. One parliamentary hearing turned explosive when a previously classified American cable was read aloud, its language as cold as the ice it described. It instructed officials to maintain plausible deniability at all costs, even if Denmark directly questioned the presence of nuclear material in Greenland. The words rang like a betrayal in the chamber, and the anger was palpable. For decades, Danish leaders had reassured their citizens that their territory remained free of nuclear weapons, and now, with every new page of evidence, that promise unraveled into humiliation. In Greenland itself, elders recalled watching the Americans arrive with their convoys and heavy equipment, speaking of science and research. But now, as their grandchildren read the documents, it became clear that what had been called progress was in truth a mask for something far darker. The idea that their ancestral land, sacred in its silence, had been carved open for nuclear schemes struck a deep wound. The word betrayal scarcely captured the weight of it. They had not just been excluded from decisions about their own land. They had been used as a shield, their remoteness exploited for secrecy. Espionage mechanics threaded through the unfolding revelations. For years, the CIA had operated on the principle of controlled truth, releasing just enough to satisfy inquiries while ensuring the deeper layers of Iceworm remained untouched. Even in the 1990s, as Denmark pressed harder for answers, Langley's archivists were meticulous. Files were dripped out slowly, often in response to Freedom of Information Act requests, with pages so heavily redacted they looked more like mosaics of black ink than historical documents. Behind the scenes, American officials debated how much to give away. They understood the stakes, too much transparency, and Washington risked not just diplomatic fallout, but the exposure of a Cold War gambit that had skirted legality, morality, and perhaps even sanity. The espionage angle cut both ways. While Denmark fumed and Greenland seethed, in Russia, the intelligence community combed through its own declassified archives, trying to piece together what they had missed. The KGB reports became fodder for speculation in Moscow's think tanks, where analysts reflected on how close the Americans had come to pulling off a project that might have changed the nuclear balance in the Arctic. Some even speculated that Soviet failures to penetrate Camp Century more deeply represented one of the great blind spots of Cold War intelligence. A phantom had haunted their reports, a suspicion never quite confirmed, and now, long after the game was over, the truth was emerging too late to act upon. And yet, the most haunting suspense was not found in the spy games or diplomatic confrontations, but in the ice itself. Scientists in the 1990s began warning that the Greenland ice sheet was not as eternal as once believed. If climate change accelerated its melt, the buried toxic waste from Camp Century, fuel residues, chemical pollutants, biological waste, even traces of radioactive material, could one day seep into the environment. What had been entombed in secrecy could return as a literal poison flowing into the Arctic seas. For Greenlanders, this revelation was like a ghost resurfacing, a time bomb planted by foreign hands that might still detonate, not in an explosion of missiles, but in the slow poisoning of their water, their soil, their lives. The spy thriller tension was sharpened by the realization that the cover-up was still, in many ways, ongoing. American officials, even in the 2000s, were reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of Iceworm. Danish politicians, facing their own public's fury, struggled to explain how their nation had been kept in the dark for so long, and Greenland's people, who had been the most affected, were left to grapple with the knowledge that their homeland had been treated as expendable, a chessboard upon which greater powers had played. As the files from both Washington and Moscow continued to surface into the 2000s, a chilling question emerged. Had America truly buried Iceworm forever, or had they only buried part of it? Were there deeper layers of the plan, still hidden, still waiting behind walls of classification that might never come down? Danish journalists began pursuing the leads, filing request after request, unearthing hints of additional tunnels, additional stockpiles, operations whose names had never been uttered in public. Each discovery suggested that the official narrative, the one finally admitted in the 1990s, was still only the tip of the iceberg. The audience of history was left hanging on a cliff's edge. Greenland's ice was melting faster than ever. The toxic remains of Camp Century, the lies documented in cold bureaucratic memos, the suspicions preserved in KGB files, all of it pointed to a truth not yet fully unearthed. The cover-up might have collapsed in part, but the time capsule of Iceworm was not finished revealing its secrets, and as whispers grew that scientists could soon physically uncover what had been left behind, the suspense tightened into a single, unnerving question. Had America merely postponed its most dangerous secret, burying it in ice with the hope that no one would ever look again? Or was the real revelation still waiting beneath Greenland's frozen skin? In the early years of the 21st century, when the Cold War had already slipped into the shadows of history books and the great superpower rivalries seemed replaced by new conflicts and new anxieties, a quiet discovery began to breathe life back into a story that should have remained buried. Scientists working with radar equipment, instruments designed not to uncover espionage, but to map ice and understand the changing climate, found ghostly echoes deep beneath Greenland's frozen surface. What they saw looked at first like geological noise, but soon their screens betrayed an outline far too regular to be natural. Straight corridors, square chambers, the unmistakable skeleton of something man-made preserved in the ice like a time capsule from another century. It was camp century again, or what was left of it, flickering back into view after decades of silence. A frozen scar whispering about a plan that was never meant to be found again. The instruments did not just show the tunnels, they revealed something darker. The ice was shifting, melting faster than ever, and what had once been locked away in perpetual frost was inching closer to the surface. The revelation was not just scientific curiosity. Among the radar shadows lurked unanswered questions, the kind intelligence agencies specialize in. Because while archives from the 1990s had pulled the veil off America's deception of Denmark, and while old Soviet files hinted they had always suspected an underground fortress, there were gaps that had never been filled. Memos that ended mid-sentence, blueprints referenced but never surfaced, inventories that did not match the supposed dismantling records. Those who knew the language of secrecy could read between the lines. Not every paper had been released, not every file had been declassified. Perhaps somewhere in a secure vault in Washington or Langley, detailed schematics of Iceworm's nuclear ambitions remained untouched, not because they were irrelevant, but because even now, in the 21st century, they were too volatile to reveal. For the scientists staring at their data, the concern was ecological. The reactor waste, the buried diesel, the debris of an abandoned secret city could leak into Greenland's fragile environment once the ice gave way. For intelligence historians and the few surviving operatives who still remembered the whispers of Iceworm, the concern was different. What if what lay below was not just environmental poison, but evidence of deception that stretched far beyond what had ever been admitted? What if Iceworm had not just been a failed plan, but a partially realized one, leaving fragments of an arsenal entombed in the glacier, sleeping until the world grew warm enough to set it free? The story refused to remain buried. In Washington, small activist groups pushed for transparency, invoking freedom of information laws and climate urgency as they demanded the full record of Iceworm be opened. The requests were often met with heavily blacked-out pages, documents released with ink obscuring every useful detail. In Copenhagen, the discovery reignited old anger. Denmark had been lied to once before, and now they saw that the lie had consequences still unfolding in their time. Greenlanders, long ignored in the decisions made over their homeland, felt a quiet fury, learning that their land, their ice, had been chosen as the hiding place for weapons and reactors that could outlast nations. One Greenlander elder was quoted as saying that America had treated the ice as if it were another concrete bunker, forgetting that ice moves, shifts, and someday releases what it swallows. His words were not poetic, they were prophetic. The espionage community, meanwhile, could not resist revisiting the ghost. Analysts poured through Cold War intercepts, old Soviet cable traffic, and fragments of declassified reports, hunting for clues. One tantalizing Soviet file described how KGB watchers in the 1960s had intercepted whispers of a city of steel under the snow, but had never managed to confirm its existence. For decades they debated whether it was disinformation, a ghost planted by the CIA to drain their attention. Now, with radar revealing what the KGB had only imagined, it looked like both sides had been trapped in the same hall of mirrors, each suspecting, each deceived, each unable to prove the truth. Iceworm had remained what it was always designed to be, an enigma wrapped in secrecy, buried in a place no one could easily reach. Yet secrets have a way of drawing light, and in the age of Hollywood and streaming platforms, Iceworm's rediscovery became irresistible. Films and documentaries reimagined the camp as a Cold War thriller, complete with spies tunneling through ice, nuclear warheads slumbering below the polar night, and double agents leaking maps to Moscow. These dramatizations blurred fact and fiction, but they also ensured that Iceworm, once a classified code word, became a cultural touchstone. Viewers asked themselves if such audacity was possible, if a nuclear city under the ice could really have existed, and the answer, though more complicated than the script suggested, was yes. The cinematic versions did not exaggerate the paranoia, the deception, or the willingness to endanger entire regions for strategic advantage. Those had always been real. Then came the newest twist, one that would have been unthinkable in the days of Cold War telegrams and safe houses. Artificial intelligence tools, designed to reconstruct lost voices from scraps of recordings, were turned toward newly surfaced audio tapes of military planners. Fragments of conversations, once too degraded to parse, began to form words again. Analysts heard generals speaking in clipped tones about grid expansions, logistics along the ice ridge, and the haunting phrase, "arsenal potential if required." Each fragment was mundane enough to be dismissed, but together they suggested that Iceworm had advanced further than official history ever acknowledged. These AI-restored voices from the past did not just confirm deception, they hinted at decisions made in quiet rooms where the line between plan and execution blurred. And so, Iceworm re-entered the present not as a relic, but as a living question. Climate change turned the Greenland ice sheet into a slow-moving bomb of revelation, each melting layer peeling back decades of lies. Geopolitical tensions revived as well, with Russia, China, and NATO all recognizing that Arctic territory once chosen for secrecy was now becoming a contested frontier for resources and shipping. In this new rivalry, Iceworm's story was no longer just about the past. It was a warning, a reminder that the Arctic is never as empty as it seems. Beneath the snow are footprints, and beneath the ice are secrets waiting for their turn in the thaw. Some historians argue that all the crucial files have already been released, that nothing truly game-changing remains hidden. But others point to the gaps, the cross-referenced but absent documents, and the strange persistence of classification stamps on anything tied to Iceworm's logistics. The very absence is telling. In intelligence, what you cannot see is often more important than what you can. And the suspicion grows that somewhere, perhaps still sealed in a secure facility, there exists a set of blueprints, maps, or operational orders that would confirm Iceworm was more than a failed experiment. Until those files surface, or until the ice itself delivers the truth, the mystery will endure. That is what makes Iceworm different from other Cold War secrets. Most conspiracies either collapse into myth or are stripped bare by declassification. But Iceworm remains caught between, half revealed, half denied, preserved by both the deliberate secrecy of governments and the accidental preservation of glacial time. It is a secret city both real and imagined, a monument to human paranoia as much as to human engineering, a place that reminds us that lies, like ice, can appear solid for decades until the right pressure causes them to crack. And now, as satellites trace the shrinking white of Greenland and sensors measure the rising temperatures, the countdown begins. In a few decades, perhaps sooner, the buried reactor shell, the forgotten waste, and the rusting skeleton of America's hidden city will no longer be trapped. The ice, indifferent to secrecy, will yield it all back to the world. What humanity decides to do with that revelation, treat it as a cautionary tale, exploit it for spectacle, or bury it again under new lies, remains unwritten. Beneath Greenland's ice lies a city built on paranoia, betrayal, and lies, and the ice remembers. As the ice finally begins to release its long-buried secrets, we are reminded that even the coldest silence can hide the hottest betrayals. In our next episode, we step into the corridors of the FBI, where Robert Hansen, a devout Sunday churchgoer, lived a double life of weekday treachery, passing America's most guarded secrets to Moscow for decades. How could one man infiltrate the very heart of intelligence and betray a nation from within? And what drove him to risk everything in the shadows?